Wow. Thank you all for coming out tonight. If you can remember last year's event, we got 27 inches of snow and had about 74 people. It's a nice turnout tonight, and I appreciate that. It'll be a memorable night for all of us, for sure, especially for me. Tonight's my 21st birthday. And I passed up on the bars to spend the day with Newt and Callista. So, for the rest of my life, I guess I'll be able to say that they came to my party, more or less. Following World War I, a man from Ohio took to the campaign trail with a message of a return to normalcy. He carried that message to the White House in the largest landslide in United States history. That man was Warren G. Harding. The brave men and women of our armed forces are returning home today for their own return to normalcy. They return home to their families, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, sons and daughters, friends and neighbors. Return home with injuries both physical and psychological. As Americans, it's our responsibility to help these people in this difficult period of readjustment. So tonight, we'll be collecting donations for the Wounded Warrior Foundation. Our ushers will be going through the aisles, collecting these donations, and we hope that you will support us in this endeavor. I thought it was a fitting way to start off the night, as support of our military spans across all party lines. It's shared by all Americans. And in the spirit of unity, uniting us as a campus and as a country, I thought it would be a fitting way to start off the night. While they make their way throughout the audience, I wanted to take a moment to recognize a few people. Throughout the crowd, there are veterans as well as current active members of the United States Armed Forces. The Amherst College Republicans are proud to have two members of the military, one veteran who served in the most dangerous part of Afghanistan for 4 years. We also have a member of the Air Force ROTC who, upon graduation, is slated to protect our country for generations to come. The Amherst College Republicans, in changing note, are committed to the Constitution. We respect your right of speech, and we demand that you respect ours in return. Speaking on behalf of the Amherst College Republicans, we wholeheartedly welcome those who may differ with my personal views, with our group's views, the speaker's views, or his family's views. We ask that you do so in a manner respectful to both the speaker, his family, his wife, beautiful wife is in attendance tonight, and to the rest of the crowd, so that we have a dialogue that is the most thought-provoking, productive possible. So before we get started, to introduce the speaker. Newt Gingrich started his professional career as a college professor for 8 years in which he taught history and environmental science. Following his career as a professor, he represented the 6th District of Georgia in the House of Representatives. He went on to become the House Minority Whip, and after 6 years, in 1995, he became the Speaker of the House. The United States Congress, under his direction, passed legislation that helped to add 11 million jobs to the United States economy, bringing unemployment down to 4.2%, all while government revenues skyrocketed. They skyrocketed not because of tax hikes, but because of the exact opposite, tax cuts. Under his direction, the United States Congress cut taxes for the first time in 16 years, including the largest capital gains cut in United States history. He also passed welfare reform, saved Medicare from bankruptcy, and passed FDA reform. In naming him Times Man of the Year for 1995, they said that great leaders make things happen. Exceptional leaders make them inevitable. And Newt Gingrich certainly belongs in the category of exceptional. The Washington Times named him the indispensable leader. He was the architect of the Contract of America, which was the namesake for tonight's event. He has raised millions of dollars for charity, included Habitat for Humanity, the United Cerebral Palsy, among others. Please join me in a warm welcome to the former Speaker of the United States Congress, the United States House of Representatives, to Amherst College.
Cities and farms, it's open arms. One day, as they handed me my... How you like me now? 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 How you like me now?
Wow. I have to confess that when we first agreed to come up here, I didn't quite expect to have this full a house, so I'm thrilled to have a chance to chat with all of you, and I look forward very much to the question and answer session at the very end. And I will tell you that we weren't quite certain whether or not we could do this, and then we discovered that it was Robert's birthday, and we thought, how could we turn him down? We just had an obligation to come and be part of this. So I hope all of you will join me in wishing him a happy birthday at some point during the evening. It's a great thing to be here. You know, I'm going to talk about a concept which I think, particularly for the students, could have a decisive impact on your lives. And Callista and I are both delighted to be here, and we find ourselves in the unusual position. My wife, who's sitting down here in the front, and she's just written her third children's book introducing 4 to 8-year-olds to American history with a time-traveling pachyderm named Ellis the elephant. Now, I realize for most of you this is a little bit simple as a book, but it was interesting because as we would work together, she's written 3 of them now, and we would look at what made America a remarkable country and what were the characteristics that had been sort of American. And we found ourselves, her newest book, Yankee Doodle Dandy, is about the winning of the American Revolution. And at the same time, I was writing Breakout, which in a sense is aimed at telling the adults what we need to do to remain a remarkable country. And I think that for your generation, this is one of the most important conversations you're going to have, because we are in a cycle where we don't quite know what our future ought to be. We don't quite know what our values ought to be, and we don't quite know what to make of a government that on the one hand is very, very important, and on the other hand is remarkably incompetent. And I don't make that comment lightly. We were just looking a little while ago. Nelson Mandela, president of South Africa who passed away, visited the United States 6 times between the time he was released from prison in 1990 and 2003. I was privileged as Speaker of the House to be with President Clinton to greet him in 1998 when we gave him the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest honor that Congress can give to somebody who's not a military person. And yet I was very surprised to discover, while we were doing some work for Crossfire the other day at CNN, that the State Department had not delisted him as a terrorist until 2008. Now, I want you to think about this. He visits in 1990 in a front page, day after day, tour, because he has just been released from prison, and he was a world figure, and everywhere he went, he got huge crowds. He came back 2 more times before he became president. He then came back as president of South Africa. Now, every one of these visits is a huge event, page 1, evening television coverage. He then comes back and has the entire Congress and the president. And in all that time, over an 18-year period, nobody at the State Department had noticed that maybe he should be delisted. And literally did not happen until the bureaucracy finally got around to it 18 years later. Now, Well, that's a sign of our own inefficiency as a bureaucracy. You'll be pleased to know that we were not as bad as Canada. Because in Canada, they couldn't get him delisted because of the internal bureaucracy, and they had to actually grant him honorary citizenship in order to let him come into the country, because they could not get their bureaucracy to work. And I want to suggest to all of you that one of the greatest challenges for your generation is going to be to fundamentally rethink this 130-year-old model that we have of a bureaucratic structure. This goes all the way back to the 1880s. Now imagine if I walked in here and I said to you, I have this great new idea. It involves a steam engine, a stagecoach, a manual typewriter, candles, and an ice box that uses ice for refrigeration. You would think I was nuts. All those things were common in 1880. And yet think of all the things that have changed. But the underlying core structure of government, whether it's federal, state, or local, the underlying core structure has not changed. Now, I'm going to use a device tonight that many of you probably are familiar with as a starting point for this discussion. How many of you have some kind of smartphone? Raise your hand if you have a smartphone. Okay. All right. Who does not have a smartphone? The numbers are so large. Okay, you don't. Way in the back, you don't. Who else? Down here, a couple of people. The lady in red. Why do you not have a smartphone? Well, okay, this one guy up here who's. Why do you not have a?
My parents didn't buy me one.
That's what I love, is a generation of self-reliant people. So you walk around with all your friends and borrow theirs? Is that the... I'm just trying to understand this. You know, this is not bad, though. I talk to business audiences, and you'll be in a business audience that'll have like 805 people with a smartphone and 2 people with old-time cell phones. And invariably, it's because they're cheap. And you say to them, you know, why do you have the... Now, I actually went in, a couple of years ago, I burned out one of my cell phones before we got to a smartphone. I went in and I had to replace it. And being an optimist, I took it in and showed it to the guy at the cell phone store. And he took it in the back to see whether or not it could be fixed. And he came back out and he said, no, I said, this thing's dead. You got too close to some kind of electronic emitter and it's just burned out. You got to get a new phone. So I looked at phones. This was now about 8 years ago. They had a phone that was a Nokia that was like $19. And they couldn't sell it. And I said, what do you mean you got a $19 cell phone and it's not just going off the shelf like hotcakes? He said, look, this phone is impaired. It only has one ringtone. It has no screen that you can watch anything on. And it is such a boring cell phone that no teenager will buy it. So even though it was cheap, it was now obsolete and no longer available because nobody would use it. Now, my wife got an iPhone, and I had a BlackBerry. And I ignored her iPhone for a while, and she kept saying, oh, you have to try this out. You have to see this. This is really cool. So, because I can eventually be persuaded by reality, I now carry an iPhone. Now, I will confess to all of you, this is an iPhone 4. Yeah. It's not an iPhone 5. How many of you, by the way, have the Galaxy? Did anybody here have a Galaxy? Okay. Because I'm told that they have better screens. Is that right? I mean, so then this is the next great crisis at Apple. Is you only have a HD TV quality screen and color, and you're not really up to the current state of the art. And of course, within 5 years there'll be a 3D version, although you'll look weird wearing the glasses walking around town. Now, here's what I want you to think about. And I tried this on YouTube and didn't get anywhere because I said, this is really not, smartphone doesn't really work because it doesn't explain the scale of change. This phone is merely the physical representation of all of the apps and systems you connect to. So, for example, how many of you now, if you're going someplace you've never been, use GPS and put in where you're going and let the phone tell you. Raise your hand if you do that, okay? All right, this is almost universal. We were lost in a town in Avignon, France this summer. And a friend of ours who actually lives there had taken us to dinner. And he was one of those college professor types who knows enough that he never asks, even if he doesn't know. And so about midnight, we're in a very small town, everything's closed down. About midnight, we're driving around randomly because he doesn't know where we're going. He's trying to get us back to our hotel, and he's clearly lost. But he's very stubborn, and he's thinking, well, if I go left or if I do this, I'll get there soon, I'll figure it out. And I mean, like everything is shut down, so the town is dark. Calista pulls out her phone, punches in the address of the hotel. The phone figures out what street we're on in Avignon. And she starts giving our host instructions. Now, he's had a house there for 20 years. But her instructions were about an hour and a half faster than him randomly trying to find the hotel. And it was just automatic. Now, none of you think that's magic, right? It's obvious. I mean, you have a GPS system, you have a phone, you put it in. Of course that's what it does. The fact that the phone it knows the street map of Avignon, France, why not? I mean, why would you want a phone that didn't know the street map of Avignon? Now, do any of you have on your phone an app for coffee shops? I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you know the people who are desperate. I will confess to you, I'll probably get killed for this later. Calista does not have a coffee shop app. She has a McDonald's app. But wherever we are on the planet, if we're hit with this sudden, desperate need, she can plug in McDonald's and it comes up instantly. Now, here's why this gets to be exciting. The other night we were driving back. We'd done a book signing in Williamsburg. And I was really interested in the Auburn game, and then I was really interested in the Ohio State-Michigan State game. And I'm watching it live on my smartphone as we drive down the road. We had a driver. I was not watching it live while I drove down the road. But here's what we need to think about. And this is, if we can figure out how, this is part of why I wrote Breakout. If we can, because I don't actually have an answer for this. I have the beginning of an inkling, but I don't have an answer. If we can figure out that this is the central system for public health and the central system for learning, and then figure out what does that mean and how would you change everything. I'll give you one minor example. I want to attach to any extension of unemployment compensation a requirement that people learn. I want to say to folks, look, if we're going to give you money for 99 weeks, then I want to know at a minimum that you get an associate's degree at the end of that time. But I don't want to give you money for learning, for doing nothing, because I am then frankly blocking you from what you should be doing. Now, this begins to make that possible. Because you can go to some of the websites I look at. Have any of you ever gone to Khan Academy? Raise your hand if you've done Khan Academy. Did you find it useful? How many of you found the Khan Academy useful? Just raise your hand. Now, what you think about this? This is a fairly elite school. Depending on whether or not we're talking with you or with Williams, you're the best liberal arts college in the country. I know there are one or two other pretenders, but I'll pander to the home crowd here for a minute. Now, think about this. If students at an elite liberal arts college find the Khan Academy useful, how useful should it be for students who are in really bad schools and have really no idea of a successful future? And how much should we be able to design really basic introductions to reading, and really basic introductions to giving a presentation, and really basic introductions to learning how to write, so that no matter who you are or where you are or what part of the country you are, you suddenly have access. I was talking with the governor of Mississippi last week about the possibility of literally giving a smartphone to every child in the poorest counties in Mississippi. Now, this is not a new thing for me. In 1995, as Speaker, I testified in the Ways and Means Committee that we should give a laptop computer to every child. And at the time, it was seen as a very radical idea. Angus King, as governor of Maine, gave every 7th and 8th grader a laptop computer. And it began to change things. So how many of you who have used the Khan Academy think that it would be helpful if there was a way to introduce very young people to learning how to learn and some kind of device that they could use 24/7? Just raise your hand if you think that makes some sense. Just when you think about this, this is an experiment. You have a problem like diabetes. An automatic expert system that check with you personally on a regular basis. Are you checking your blood sugar? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you using insulin when you need to? You begin to suddenly have a device. This is the most powerful public health device in the United States today. But we don't use it that way yet. And you can aggregate data. You can have feedback loops that allow an expert system to record whether or not people are in fact doing what they need to be doing. So I want to start with this. We have it in our hands to break through in ways that are unbelievable. I'm going to give you 3 or 4 examples. Now, I got to this in part by looking at energy. In the year 2000, when I'd stepped down as speaker in early 1999, in the year 2000, I was giving speeches to the American chemical industry. And the American chemical industry's #1 concern was we are running out of natural gas. We're going to have to import very expensive liquefied natural gas from the Middle East. And probably the entire chemical industry, which is a pretty high-paying industry, $90,000 to $110,000 per job salary. The whole industry is probably going to go to the Middle East. It's 2000, 2001. Absolute common wisdom. Everybody agreed to it. 2 things came along. Hydraulic fracturing, which has actually been around since the 1920s, and horizontal drilling. That is, you go down and you actually bend the pipe. I don't actually know how they do this. You actually bend the pipe, and so you can drill out up to 4,000 feet from the same wellhead, which one means you do a lot less environmental damage because you have a lot fewer wells. It also means when you find a stratum that has gas or oil, you can track that particular stratum. So while it might not be profitable to just punch a hole for the amount you're going to get in the immediate area, by going out 3,000 or 4,000 feet in every direction, you suddenly make it very profitable. Now, what's the consequence? North Dakota went from a U.S. Geological Survey estimate that they were going to have 800 million barrels of oil to an estimate last year that they have 24 billion barrels of oil. Now, that's a 30-fold increase, which means whether you're talking about the American chemical industry, you're talking about jobs. In western North Dakota, which is the primary field that they're developing, they've had a 50%, for those of you who worry about economic inequality, they've had a 50% increase in wages in the last 7 years. 50%. For those of you who worry about raising the minimum wage, McDonald's now pays $15 an hour in western North Dakota, and they pay you a bonus if you sign up. That's how big the change is, because the economics are so dramatic. It has, what's the implication for the U.S. as a whole? First of all, it means we are now the #1 natural gas producer in the world. By 2015, we'll be the #1 oil producer. It means less dependence on the Middle East, less risk in terms of what's happening there, and a dramatic, very different situation. It means dramatically more jobs, and it means that manufacturing is about to rebound. Natural gas is now 5 times more expensive in Japan than it is in the United States, which means that the balance of manufacturing is coming back to the U.S., and it's largely 2 things. It is energy prices and the rise of 3D printing, because 3D printing is allowing us to begin to manufacture in a very boutique model that allows us to be unbelievably flexible, so that you can do all sorts of things. I'm just curious, how many of you are familiar with 3D printing? Just raise your hand. Okay, so this is a topic many of you have talked about. Let me give you an example about how these breakthroughs occur. I have a good friend who's the chief paleontologist at the University of Texas. And over 20 years ago, he began experimenting with the fact that you can take basically an industrial level CAT scan or MRI and you can apply it to a fossil. So if you go to your Natural History Museum, and we went this afternoon, and I really appreciate Robert taking me over there. It was fascinating. Have all of you been at least once? It's a very fine, very interesting museum. May have one of the largest collections of dinosaur tracks in the world. You can take a bone and you can put it in an industrial scanner, and you suddenly get an accurate readout of the bone. You then can put that on the internet. So if you go to a thing called digimorph.com or digimorph.org, I sometimes get it wrong, but Digimorph is a site that has 4,000 fossils, and they're all on there digitally. Now that was interesting in itself and allowed people to look at things, allowed people to share information. All of a sudden, here's what happened. With the rise of 3D printing, you can now take the data file and you can print out your own T-Rex tooth. So let's say you're a third grade class, and you want the third graders to have some sense of the awe and the extraordinary nature of a T-Rex. Well, if any of you who have relatives, have younger brothers or sisters or cousins, you let them hold a T-Rex tooth, you got their attention. Now it's real, now it's tactile, they can feel it. And this sort of thing is going on all the time. So we did a TV show at what we call Newt University, which we posted on the internet. And I interviewed Tim about this. And one of his ideas was that we are presently going to be able to take 3D printing. Clissa's mother, for example, who's 81, has had both hips replaced. And in the next model, Tim's idea is you'll be able to take 3D printing. You'll be able to take an exact MRI of her hip, and you will literally manufacture her hip replacement to fit exactly her hip, thereby increasing very much the likelihood of success and reducing the length of time it takes to recover. So we were talking about this because that's where Tim comes from. Then I raised the question of another good friend of mine who is Tony Atale, who is working at Wake Forest in regenerative medicine. Now, a lot of you know about 3D printing. How many of you know about regenerative medicine? Raise your hand. Okay, so good. So for the rest of you, regenerative medicine is very cool. It is where they take your cells and they grow a lot of them. They then, the way it's now evolving, they then put them in a 3D printer. So you want to create a kidney, they have an exact MRI of your kidney, they have the exact data size, they now have your cells. The 3D printer literally creates a kidney. And they then put the kidney back in you. Now notice, this is not a transplant, this is a replant. Now why does that matter? Well, first of all, you don't have to take all the anti-repudiation drugs. People who get transplants are on drugs the rest of their life so that they don't repudiate the thing that was put in them because it's foreign cells. With regeneration, you don't do that. But there's a second part to it. And this is where we got into sort of an argument. Are you actually going to go over here and take some kind of material and make an artificial hip? Or are you now simply going to grow a new hip? So now you're placing a new hip back in the person. It is exactly the hip size that they need because you have the MRI data. And it is their cells. And there's going to be sort of a race between these two models of how we fix things. And I'll show you how far down the road this is. The Texas Institute of Regenerative Medicine is headed by a woman doctor who has actually grown a heart through regenerative medicine. And when I began writing Breakout, we talked about pioneers of the future. Because every time you turn around, you see this kind of stuff going on, as long as you're outside of Washington. And you see scientists, you see entrepreneurs, you see technicians, you see inventors. I mean, all sorts of things are being developed. And they're not developed in a way that, as many of you know, for example, the Khan Academy was founded by a financier. He's not an educator. He's a guy making money at finance, but he wanted to educate his two nephews. So he invented the Khan Academy. So all these things are going on. And we talk about pioneers of the future. And one of the major problems, which we talk about in Breakout, is we have prison guards of the past. And an example is regenerative medicine. Almost every regenerative scientist I know of believes that their research, which is being done in American labs with American tax money, will almost certainly come to the patient in India, China, Japan, Singapore, and Europe before the US, because the Food and Drug Administration will stop them from doing it here. Because it's now so expensive to get approval from the FDA, this is not worth the effort. So the very research that could save your life someplace down the road means, and there's a new movie out, the Dallas Buyers Club, which talks about this very problem, and is based on a true story. Where a medicine exists, the guy is going to die, it hasn't been approved by the FDA, he goes to Mexico to get it, he figures out there are other people that need the medicine, he starts bringing it back for them, they create a buyer's club, because as long as you do it in a certain unique way, it's technically legal. And the FDA figures out what he's doing, so they then certify the drug in order to stop him from doing it. And their rules are such that you can't legally bring it in once it's certified, but the doctor can't prescribe it because it's not approved. And if you ever get a chance, see the Dallas Buyers Club. So you have all these prison guards of the past who are protecting and propping up the past. And let me just give you a simple model from the 1840s. If we had had today's government in the 1840s, the Stagecoach Association would have hired a lobbyist to pass a bill that said no railroad could go faster than a horse because it is unfair competition. And we would have stifled the transportation revolution for at least a generation. I mean, that's how big and how difficult the challenge is. So part of the reason I wanted to come here was to try to recruit all of you to think about, if we become a country which breaks out, if we become a country where in energy and in transportation and in education and in health and in a variety of other fields, we suddenly are doing everything that's possible, we're going to create so many jobs, we're going to extend life by such a distance, we're going to increase the ability to live independently, no matter how old you get. We're going to lower the cost of government and move back to a balanced budget, because all these things are possible. But it's not going to happen without the American people exerting enormous pressure in Washington, because Washington has no interest in fixing any of this. Now, let me give you just one or two quick examples. How many of you use an ATM card to get money out of machines? Raise your hand. If we had had prison guards protecting tellers' jobs, ATM machines would only be allowed to work if there was a bank teller standing next to it to hand you the cash. Now, most of you, how many of you have not been inside a bank in the last year? Just raise your hand if you haven't been inside a bank. Think about this. You now have an ability to walk up to a machine anywhere in the world. How many of you have gotten money out of a machine outside the U.S.? Raise your hand. And think about this. You walk up to an anonymous machine in a strange country you've never been in. You put in a plastic card. The screen lights up with 6 or 7 languages. You pick one of the ones you're good at. Often English. You punch in a 4-number code. It reaches out across 7 international boundaries, finds your bank, validates who you are, verifies that you have money. It then gives you the amount of local currency that you put in, which, by the way, you had no idea what the exchange rate was. But your assumption is that it's better than the hotel. And it takes 11 seconds. Is that about right? I want you to think about how unbelievably accurate that is and how much it empowers you. It is your choice, your time, your money, because you made a decision, you wanted it. Now, by contrast, in terms of accuracy, the Internal Revenue Service last year sent $4 billion to people who did not exist for tax refunds. They sent 353 checks to one address in Shanghai. They sent over 650 checks to an address in Lithuania. Now, at one level, it should offend you because $4 billion is a fair amount of money. Over a 10-year period, the way Washington scores things, counting the cost of borrowing the money, it's probably would score at about 43 billion or 44 billion for 10 years. It should also offend you because you have a government so stupid, it sent 650 checks to the same place in Lithuania, and nobody said, gee, that's weird. Our estimate, this is one of the things that has most frustrated me since I left Congress. I cannot get anybody in Washington to pay attention to this. Our estimate is that there's about $200 billion a year that is stolen because of the sheer incompetence of the bureaucracy. You have a paper-based bureaucracy, you have a crook with an iPad. Who do you think is going to win? The bureaucrat works from 9 to 5 except for snow days. Yesterday, by the way, in Washington was a snow day. They actually had some. It was unbelievable. I was at an 8 a.m. breakfast at the Hay Adams across from the White House. The federal government had shut down. The roads were totally clear. You could go in really fast because there was nobody on the road because all of them had been told don't come in. And you got to pay for a day for the federal government to not work, which may have been an advantage, but still, there are other ways to deal with this. But think about the notion that $200 billion a year is over $2 trillion over a decade. Now look at yesterday's budget agreement, which verges on pathos. You can always tell how bad a deal is if nobody can tell the truth about it. So this is a budget agreement that doesn't raise spending because in the out years, they're actually going to cut spending while they're raising spending in the next 2 years. Now, how many of you believe, as a matter of simple common sense, that a budget deal which is going to eventually cut spending in 2021, but it's going to increase spending next year, that the net effect is it's going to increase spending? Because you're never going to get the out-year cuts because they'll have another budget deal. It also, you can tell that how bad a deal it is because nobody can tell you the truth about taxes. They raise taxes in this deal, but they can't call them taxes because if you're a Republican, you're not allowed to raise taxes. So they have much higher fees. The fees are mandatory. I think it's $11 per trip if you fly on an airplane. Now, I've always thought if it's a mandatory taking from you of money, that probably is a tax. You know, it'd be like the tax on tea that Clister writes about in Yankee Doodle Dandy. I mean, can you imagine the British government saying, this is not a tax. This is a tea sipping fee. And therefore, you should not say no taxation without representation. You should say no tea sipping fee without representation, because we're telling you we're not going to call it a tax, therefore it's not a tax, and we don't understand why you're mad at us when all it is a fee on tea sipping. Now, nobody with any common sense would have thought that was true. It was a tax. So what you get is a tiny, pathetic deal in which we're going to raise spending while raising taxes, while claiming we're not raising spending and we're not raising taxes. And major reason I wrote Breakout is I do not believe you can fix the problems in Washington inside the current right-left divide, and I don't think you can fix it without enormous breakthroughs in how we do business. And I'm going to close with one example that I'm fascinated by. And it's a great case study in entrepreneurialism. And I'm going to tell you about one particular person who is changing two different fields. He's changing transportation and he's changing education. His name is Sebastian Thrun. Sebastian Thrun was born in Germany, but he wanted to be in a really entrepreneurial, dynamic country. So he came to Carnegie Mellon, where he studied artificial intelligence. He then responded to a DARPA Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency challenge to see if you could build a self-driving car that could cross the Mojave Desert. And in the early years of this test, they had annual tests. In the early years, it was pathetic. I mean, the cars didn't know where they were going. They didn't go very far. They got stuck in the sand. Gradually, they got better and better and better. And finally, Carnegie Mellon had a really good, on the desert with nobody near it, car that could drive a fair distance. At which point, he left Carnegie Mellon, and he went to Google. And he headed up the Google self-driving car project. Google today has a car which has driven over 600,000 miles on California highways. It has never once caused a wreck. It has been in one accident when a human being rear-ended it in 600,000 miles. It's been improving every year, so it now goes about 80,000 miles between any kind of incident because it's now sophisticated enough in knowing what to do that if it sees a baby carriage coming out here and a deer coming out there, it knows how to respond to both pieces of data simultaneously. Volvo recently, every major car manufacturer is working on self-driving car. Volvo recently drove a number of cars that are all self-driving so close together. If you ever watched a NASCAR race, they created drafting. Because the self-driving cars, when you get close enough, you're flowing in the slipstream of the car ahead of you. You save 23% of your fuel usage if you can draft. It turns out because self-driving cars are so fast at responding to data, you can actually drive so close, you would have to change the tailgating law of every state. You'd have to say you're not allowed to tailgate unless you're self-driving. But a self-driving car can literally be extraordinarily close. This also means, by the way, you have 3 times as much space on the highway as you do now. Because think about when you're driving, you have to leave enough space between you and the car ahead of you that you can notice it change its behavior and you can brake before you hit it. Because the self-driving car responds so rapidly, you literally at rush hour get 3 times as many cars on a highway with a self-driving car. Now that all sounds a little bit like science fiction, except that about 3 months ago, I was in Peoria, Illinois, standing next to a 40-ton truck. It's the biggest truck Caterpillar makes. They had just sold 24 of them to a mine in Western Australia where they would be self-driving. They would go from the top of the mine down to the bottom, get filled up with 40 tons of material, drive back up to the top, drop off the material, go back down, get 40 tons of material. They could do it 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, except for maintenance and getting fuel. I think it's diesel. The people at the mine estimate they save $1 million a year per truck. The U.S. Army has a parallel project at Oshkosh, Wisconsin, because they have a very simple model. If you can run a convoy that has 9 trucks without a person in it and 1 truck with a person in it, and an IED goes off, a roadside bomb goes off, the odds are pretty high no one gets hurt, because you're probably hitting a vehicle that doesn't have anybody in it. And so the Army's very interested, and the Marines are very interested in how you can design this kind of technology. Now, Thrun had already done something that was pretty amazing. Here's a guy who has, begun developing a self-driving vehicle. And the head of Mercedes said he thought their first self-driving cars would be on the road in 2020. Government will be the biggest problem. Government regulations will be an enormous challenge. Thrun then shifted. He and the chief of research at Google decided they would teach a course at Stanford on advanced computing. And they decided as a lark they would put it online. So one Friday afternoon he posted, if you want to take our course, you can sign up. He didn't have approval from the Stanford administration. The course had 400 students at Stanford. It had 151,000 online, which led to certain conflict with the Stanford administration. 40-some thousand passed the course. Now, it had 2 interesting side effects. One is if you're Google, imagine the human resources opportunity. You just identified 40-some thousand people you may want to interview about being hired for a job. Second, and this was very humbling for Sebastian, who told me this story himself. He suddenly discovered that if you were a Stanford student who took the course online, you learned more than if you came to his class. That the course online was built around solving problems, and students were learning by solving the problems. And he said to me, I love my lectures. I thought I was a great lecturer. I loved giving the lectures. Students seemed to like listening to the lectures. And I suddenly discovered I was a terrific lecturer, but I wasn't a very good teacher. Because if you took my course online and solved the problems, you learned far more than if you took the course from me in a classroom. So he was confronted with a real conflict of professionalism. He then founded a company called Udacity, the word audacity with the A missing. Udacity has, and you all will find this interesting given what you're currently paying, Udacity has, as its stated goal, to reduce tuition by 90%. They signed a contract 3 months ago with Georgia Tech. They took a $70,000 master's degree program. It is now online for $7,000. And they are beginning to move. Now, I'm just giving that as an example. I am not arguing that tomorrow morning you should walk in and ask why you're still paying 100%. But I am saying to you, take all the different things I've described to you. 3D printing, regenerative medicine, online learning, self-driving vehicles. We are at the edge of breakouts that are unbelievably exciting. And the challenge for your generation is to decide to make them real. We are as much at the edge of the future, we're as much at a new frontier as we have been at any point in American history. And your generation has a chance to participate on a gigantic scale. And I really want to stop because I want to give you a chance to ask questions. And I think I'm told that we have 2 questions already on video, so I'm going to do what I'm told. And then after those 2 questions, we're going to ask you all if you want to come up to microphones. And we'll get through as many as we can because I'm thrilled that you're here. And I'm delighted that you'd give me this chance to talk with you.
Thank you, Speaker. If everyone will remain seated for just a moment, you can read his accomplishments on Wikipedia, but only by listening to him can we understand how he was able to accomplish those things. A little representation of his leadership. He was able to galvanize the Republican Party to capture a majority in the House and the Senate for the first time in 40 years, and then to win re-election 2 years later for the first time since 1969. Keep in mind that this happened when Clinton won re-election, which stands as the only time a majority has won re-election when a president of the opposite party has also won their candidacy. So we'll start off. We have 2 quick questions. They're going to be like 20 seconds long. It'll be a really cool dynamic, and then the speaker will respond to them, and then we'll open it up to the audience for as long as we can.
You worked with Newt Gingrich. Was he an enemy of yours while you were in the White House?
Until he got to be Speaker and until the government shut down, he was way more political than I would have been. He's defended what he called scorched earth politics. And when we were working together, I enjoyed it. And I think he has a lot of knowledge, and I think he comes up with some quite creative ideas.
The question stands, how would you characterize your relationship with President Clinton, and how would you characterize the relationship between President Obama and the current House Speaker, John Boehner?
Well, radically different. There are a couple of things you have to understand. Bill Clinton really likes people. That was it? No, can I finish, or do you want to go ahead? I mean, if you're tired of that answer, we can just go to the next one. Now, a couple of quick things. Bill Clinton really likes people. And he has, Cliff and I were at a memorial service for Speaker Tom Foley a couple of weeks ago, and we were sitting on the front row, and President Clinton and President Obama were all sitting right over here, catty corner to us. They were on the front row on that side. And you could watch their behaviors. Bill turned and nodded at me once, and then nodded at Cliff, I think, 5 times. And, you know, he was totally engaged with the audience. And when he got up to speak, he had this knack of looking right at you, so every person there felt that he was engaged with them. President Obama came in and sat basically looking towards the ceiling, enduring a brief period of being surrounded by mortals. And then when he spoke, he literally, because we were sitting right in front of him when he was speaking, he literally was looking above us. Now, I mean, he's a great orator and he's a terrific speaker, but to get things done in politics It's enormously helpful if you like people. And it's enormously helpful if you learn to put up with people. And Clinton and I had a lot of things in common. We're both sort of permanent graduate students. So we could get together when we weren't fighting, and we could talk about books, and we could talk about ideas, and we could talk about all sorts of stuff. And it created an ability to get things done. He'd also been governor. He understood that you have a legislature. That if you don't get the legislature to work with you, you don't get anything done. So very different. Boehner has a job 10 times harder than I did. First of all, he has a Democratic Senate. I had a Republican Senate. But in addition, he has a president who has no inclination for negotiating at a personal level. And the difference it makes if you can look at each other, you know, Hillary Clinton said the other week that we would fight all morning and negotiate all evening. And that was a pretty accurate portrait. You know, we'd both hold press conferences, we'd both attack each other, we were both out to win, but we also understood that for the country's sake, we had to find a way to win together, because that's what our Constitution required. We got welfare reform passed. Largest decline in children in poverty in American history is the 4 years after welfare reform. We balanced the budget for 4 straight years. We created millions of jobs through joint effort. We collaborated on foreign policy. It was a very hard-working, serious thing. It wasn't easy, but I give President Clinton a lot of credit for having been willing to be part of a working team and not just be aloof and try to stand off and get nothing done.
Option abandons America's sense of fair play. It's the one thing this country stands for. I would say this is not parliamentarily appropriate. You cannot change the Senate rules by a pure majority vote. And I pray God when the Democrats take back control, we don't make the kind of naked power grab you are doing. But
Senate Democrats used what's known as the nuclear option to change the rule.
So the question is, what are your thoughts about the nuclear option, and how will it affect American politics in the near future?
The Senate is an institution which has been decaying for about 20 years. And it's been decaying under both parties' leadership. And it's been decaying in part because in the age of television and Twitter and Facebook and instant gratification, the idea of somebody slowing something down is painful. It's sort of the MTV effect. If you watch movies that were made before MTV, they have much longer scenes. If you watch movies that have been made since MTV, they do a lot of jump cutting and a lot of very short scenes, and they would feel very choppy to somebody who watched movies in the 1930s, and movies in the 1930s, to all of you, look like they were made by people who are sleepwalking. The Senate, in that sense, may have become an institution out of sync with the cultural reality. Remember, the Senate was created in part to be a brake on the House. It was designed in part to slow down things. And in order to do that, the Senate had a rule that any senator could speak as long as they wanted to. That rule was not abridged until 1917. And in 1917, they adopted what they called the ability to have cloture, which started out being 67 votes. If 67 senators said you talk long enough, they could cut you off. And then it got down to 60 votes because they didn't think it was too hard to get 67. Now it's down to 51 votes. And what this does is it makes the Senate a second House of Representatives. What I think will be fascinating, and apparently nobody on the Democratic side thought about this, I'm going to work very hard to make sure that the Republicans keep the new rules. And what that means is if we win in 16, in the first 100 days of 1917, we can repeal everything because there will be no ability in the Senate to stop it. And all these clever guys who thought they were being smart are all of a sudden find when they're in the minority, they've given up the most powerful tool. The reason we used to be told you can't get things done is you can't stop the people in the Senate from filibustering. They just got down where 51 votes is all you need. I think in the long run for the country, it's not a good thing. I think it's a fact. And I think in January, February, and March of 2017, they will look back and think it's one of the biggest mistakes they've ever made.
And now we'll open it up to audience Q&A. The winner of our contest, Paul, will be first up. Feel free to make your way to the standing mics, and we'll go from there. But again, Paul Tyler first.
Okay. I'm assuming you're Paul. Good, okay, go for it. Are these microphones on? Speak into it for a second, let's see if they're controlling us. Again, they have to have a green light on. So let's see if hers is on. Yes, speaks.
When you were Speaker of the House, you helped pass welfare reform, and it seems that some employers have seen this as an opportunity to cut labor costs by actively encouraging their employees to go on to government assistance. And so if the federal government is helping pay for their employees to make sure that they don't fall below a certain minimum standard of living, then they don't have to take responsibility for their own labor costs. And so some Democrats have proposed hiking the federal minimum wage, and my question is, what's the conservative solution?
Well, I think the conservative position is that you are going to see a significant rise in teenage unemployment if you in fact raise the minimum wage. And you look at current teenage unemployment levels, a lot of people are willing to pay that price, but when you look at a place like Greece that has 57% unemployment among people under 25, you ought to be very cautious about raising the cost of labor, because there are only about 3 million people who get paid minimum wage. I mean, and primarily minimum wage is an entry-level wage to learn how to show up for work, so you then improve. The other thing is to remember, a lot of the people you're talking about are people who work for tips, and they may get a very low wage, like $1.50 or $2 an hour, but they're also making a lot of money on tips. And most of those people would not want to swap the money they make on tips in order to get some kind of government-mandated amount. So I'm very cautious about the minimum wage, and I think most studies have indicated that the minimum wage, in fact, is very anti-minority and it's very anti-young people.
Hi, Newt. I'm so glad to meet you. Amy Zuckerman, reformed media person, author, journalist. Cannot wait to meet you because I have a challenge for your life. I have some books for you, by the way. Now, what do we want to do? Many years ago, I came as a political refugee from Worcester, Massachusetts, after hitting 35 politicians in one day, running a secret government. In this university, I've worked at college. Many, many people have written books with me. I want to write some books together. Everyone here, have you come back? You can stay with us. And come to the new Amherst. The future work is the work of the mobile, global, untethered worker and business person. I don't think many people in this room know what the Small Business Administration is. They don't know what the Small Business Development Centers are. They know a lot about technology. They don't know when you probably enter the Congress. And we need to write 2 books, and also some kids' books.
Excuse me, please get to your point.
Getting to my point is that I'd like to invite Mr. Gingrich to talk to us. I have some books for him.
Okay, well,
and work
we're
together.
going to be right back across the hall after this is
but
over.
I hope that
We're
you will talk a little bit about the future of work to these people here and discuss your thoughts about that.
Well, I think the future of work is going to go to those who are persistent and creative. And I think you're going to have a worldwide economy, and I think you'll have a lot of people who create their own jobs. And I think in that sense, you'll see an entire generation in which you are as likely to be your own entrepreneur as you are to work for somebody else. Yes?
As you said in your speech, you've been a proponent of shale gas hydrofracking. How can you support this when the Environmental Protection Agency has proven fracking has poisoned hundreds of ground wells? Or taking into account that our continual dependence on natural gas only exacerbates the climate crisis? Because the methane leaks makes it worse than coal. In September, you spoke at a natural gas industry conference in the convention center, showing your ties to the fossil fuel industry and your priorities with the corporations rather than with the American people.
Wait. One at a time. What?
Please let us finish.
No, go for it.
You called shale gas developers the pioneers of the future. But the truth is, they're not the future. We are. We're here to represent the students and the youth who refuse to live in a world that promotes injustice, environmental degradation,
I just want to know
and
something.
corporate control.
Okay, can you tell me something?
Please let us finish. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I stand with the frontline communities and all of the individuals who have had their land destroyed and their water contaminated by destructive industries. And I'm here to say that I don't think that you stand for what's best for our planet or for the American people.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Since you're the future, by your own definition, what's your energy solution?
Is locally owned, renewable energy for the people, by the people, not for corporate profits.
What kind of energy?
Localized wind and solar.
So wind, which kills more birds than any other energy system.
That is inaccurate.
It is. Would you like to guess how many birds are killed by wind? Enough that the current administration is actually exempting them from federal laws, which would put them in jail for the number of birds they're killing.
I'm sorry, but I think you should agree that the American people are a little bit more important than birds.
Ah, the American people are more important than birds? Okay.
But I will say that the tailings ponds.
I like that. I can't wait to report to the Sierra Club that I've been at Amherst and had somebody explain to me that people are more important than birds. This is a revolutionary moment. Okay, wait a second. All right, let me answer your
that are
charge.
created as a result of tar sands extraction kill birds as well.
But let me just
I don't see you opposing
let me
that.
just say, I think what you said about fracking and groundwater is technically not true, period. People have a huge mistake about old casings that are 50, 70, 80 years old. Fracking occurs at 8,000 feet and below. It is not, you have all sorts, there's a nice geology part of the museum over here. You have all sorts of rock formations between what's happening down there and what's up here, and I just think it's not true. And I think that if you check, you'll find state by state, the public health people do not believe what you said is true, period. Next person.
It's a tough act to follow. In an interview with Sean Hannity this past September, you said, quote, Tip O'Neill had 12 government shutdowns while he was speaker. This is not like this is a crisis. This is not the end of government as we know it. This is part of the process by which executive and legislative branches collide. When the government shuts down, people pay attention, and when people pay attention, things get clarified, end quote. My question is, regardless of what party is responsible for shutting down the government, don't you feel that a system that requires the shutdown in order to get things clarified, in order to get attention and to interact across branches is fundamentally flawed or at least improperly run?
I think that it's the system the Founding Fathers designed. I think they designed a system to minimize the risk of dictatorship by deliberately creating a machine so inefficient that we can barely get it to work voluntarily. And I think they would have said that I think with good presidential leadership, you should be able to avoid most shutdowns. But I also think there are times when you have a fundamental disagreement. This whole idea, which some people on the left say that Obama won the election, which is true. So did the House Republicans. So now you have a mixed result. And the question is, can you find leadership good enough to accept that with a mixed result, you can still work together? Clinton and I initially couldn't agree. We had 2 shutdowns. At the end of those 2 shutdowns, we found new ways to talk with each other, new ways to agree. But it was tough. I mean, it was not fun. And I think that sometimes that happens. My only point was, again, there's all this talk about how terrible it was to shut the government down. I drove in yesterday to the Hay Adams across the street from the White House, which had no snow on it, while listening to reports the government had closed because of snow. I mean, the people of Buffalo who were going to work yesterday to pay taxes for the government that wasn't showing up, somehow nobody said, oh, this is terrible. How can the government just shut down over non-snow? So I think there's a certain level of hysteria designed by either party when they're in a situation that they're facing this. I don't advocate shutdowns, but they are not a crisis of the system. Sure. They are a part of the system.
Right, and you referenced that there was the system that was made by the Founding Fathers, but would it really be so bad if we found, in 230 some years, if we had found some better way to run things? Would it really be so terrible if we had learned something in the past 230 years?
I think with great leadership, you can improve things, but I would suggest to you that this has been the system which has kept people the freest and the safest of any system in the world, and I'd be a little cautious about making it too efficient, because efficiency leads to dictatorship.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Speaker Gingrich, thank you for coming to talk with us tonight. You cited several innovations that have profoundly positively influenced our lives. For instance, the iPhone and the GPS that goes with it, both of which received substantial government investment in their original development. Apple in the 1980s received a $500,000 small business development grant. The GPS was developed by the Pentagon during World War II. How can you not be incredibly critical of conservatives and Republicans in Congress and Senate today who look to remove all sources of United States government investment from the private sector, especially those investments which are essential for providing sustainable sources of energy for our future, like wind and solar?
Well, you just jumped from a place I agree with you totally to a place I'm skeptical. So let me give you two answers. I think you're right. Look, I helped double the National Institutes of Health while balancing the federal budget. And I wish, in retrospect, we had tripled the National Science Foundation. So I think there are areas of basic research where the government's invaluable. I think there are areas of development. You wouldn't have jet aircraft today if the Air Force hadn't bought them first. So I think you're absolutely right. You can't explain modern computing without the Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Pentagon and a 10-year-long project of government grants that enabled researchers to develop the future. So if you say to me, do I think we ought to have really good basic research in advanced technology for energy? 100%. I couldn't agree more. If you say to me, do I think the federal government should pretend it can be a venture capitalist and go out and start investing in technology companies like Solyndra? I think that is insane, because the people who do that, who do it well, make an immense amount of money, and the bureaucrats who do it badly. And I think the government is not a particularly good investor in specific companies, but it can be an enormously powerful creator of research from which many companies can grow.
But so you do think we should invest in research and development for sustainable energy?
Of course.
Thank you.
I've voted for it in the past. Yes, it's okay.
Hi there, nice to see another Republican in Western Mass. I thought I was alone. Actually, there are quite a few here.
Yeah.
About money in politics, what would you do? I mean, obviously, you mentioned lobbying earlier, but how would you fix it? What would you do?
I would make it possible to give any amount of after-tax income to any candidate or any party as long as you reported it every night. I think this idea that the candidate is limited to $2,600 per person and the party is limited, but Mayor Bloomberg can spend unlimited money over here, or take any right-winger, you take the Koch brothers, I'm not trying to pick on Bloomberg, although the amount he paid to buy the mayorship was fairly astonishing. And had no resemblance to democratic politics in a free society. So I think you have to look at the two models. What you have today is free speech if you're not a candidate and you're not a party. I am for free speech. I think the basic rule of the Supreme Court's right, that you're either for free speech, which involves money, or you're against free speech. Well, I think for the survival of our liberty, free speech is really central. That being said, then frankly, if the rich guy could write the check directly to the candidate, and then the candidate's responsible for the advertising, you'd have a totally different campaign. I mean, I can tell you in my own experience, ads were run against me by 527s that would never have been run against me by their candidate, because he could never have stood on the same platform. And so you get this whole phony game of, oh, I didn't really do it, I didn't know about it, oh yes, it's true, my former campaign manager was doing it, but I have nothing to do with what my former campaign manager does. Well, it just sickens the whole system and makes it dishonest. Yes, sir.
Hi. I'm using my dumb phone. But earlier you were talking about those clever criminals who are taking advantage of the tax system. And you were also talking about how regulation inhibits progress. But if we lose regulation, doesn't that leave us open to these really smart criminals who want to get ahead? And doesn't that leave us unsafe?
Well, let me draw a distinction about regulation. I'm a Theodore Roosevelt Republican in the sense that the original Food and Drug Act was designed so you could go anywhere in America and drink water. You could go and have a hamburger and it was safe to eat. I'm for basic public safety regulation. I think that's important. I'm for transparency and accountability. I think if somebody is involved in stealing from you, you should be able to get even with them, and you should be able to get your money back. So I think that in that sense, you need the law. The question is whether or not you really think another layer of bureaucrats is the solution. So take the big banks. Any bank too big to fail is too big to be managed. It's the number one problem we're faced with. In that setting, the idea you're going to have a group of regulators in Washington looking over the staff in the bank, if you think about the size of these banks and the speed with which transactions occur, is simply an absurdity. I mean, if you slow the bank down enough that the Washington bureaucrat understands it, it will be driven out of banking by competition. If you allow the bank to go as fast as the modern money market, nobody in Washington will know what happened until 3 years later. So the very core model of these kind of bureaucratic oversight, I think, has got to, and that's why I said your generation has to rethink it. I'm not here to say to you that I have a blueprint for the future. I describe Breakout as a nutrition book from which we'll eventually get cookbooks. But I think there is a ton of invention your generation will do to rethink a lot of our public policies. Okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Hi, former Speaker Gingrich. I'm very happy to be able to ask you a couple questions. I'm curious, my question lies in what you think America's role should be in given the fact that we live in a rapidly globalizing world, and that many individuals are are starting to see that we really are more of a global community. But at the same time, we have the pride that all of us at least should have in being Americans and knowing that we live in this great country. How do you think we should move forward in the future with this world and how it's changing?
I would say, that's a very good question, actually. I would say that we have to be very cautious and that we actually need a national debate about our role in the world. I believe we've lost 2 wars. I believe we've now spent the last 11 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we have to have the courage to say, we're not going to win. I mean, none of the things we said were our core goals are going to happen. And that should sober all of us, because thousands of young Americans died and tens of thousands of young Americans were severely injured and trillions of dollars were spent, and it didn't work. I think if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, there's a study the other day about the number of dollars that are sent to sub-Saharan Africa annually now between private and public aid, and it's not working. It's not working in part because we're not addressing the really core problems. And so I think that there's a real challenge that we have to really rethink our role in the world, and we have to think about both what are our strengths and what are our limitations. And this is at a time when, frankly, the Chinese are going to be much more competitive, not just in East China, in the East China Sea, where you currently have, this issue about their air rights, but worldwide. I mean, the number of Chinese who are now spread across the planet, the amount of activity they're engaged in, is really phenomenal. And the one great advantage the Chinese have is that they have lots of people. So if they want to send people around the planet, which they're eager to do, they have about 40 million surplus males because of the one-child policy, which led to a huge bias in favor of male children. And if you're the Chinese, you'd much rather have them in Sudan than in Shanghai. And so there's a huge ongoing wave of people going around the planet. That's going to have effects we don't have any clue about yet. And so I think your question is really correct, and I don't have an answer. I mean, I agree with you, and I think that it would be very healthy for this country to have an honest national dialogue about the nature of the world, our role in the world, and what we can do and what we can't do. And I think that the post-World War II model is over, and the post-Cold War model is over, and we really need a conversation about what's the 21st century American role in a dramatically changing world. And I don't think we do not today have that conversation.
Thank you very much. And I guess my last request would be that could you try to start that conversation?
Well, I'm trying to a little bit, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you watch Crossfire, we try to do it occasionally.
Hi,
Yes.
First of all, thank you for coming and speaking today. My question is kind of a little lighter, I guess. So, as former Speaker of the House, I just wanted to get a sense of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show House of Cards. Basically, just wanted to get a little bit of insight in terms of how much alliances and compromises were made when you were Speaker of the House, and the level that has changed to the modern House and Senate, if there is a change, and just speak to that a little bit, if you know.
Well, I've watched both the American version and the European and the British version. The British version is much darker and much more violent, and close to favors the American version. And I like Kevin Spacey. I think Kevin Spacey is a terrific actor. Imagine that I suggested to you a new TV series called Amherst, in which one particularly wicked student arrived, determined to bribe, blackmail, and poison professors as needed in order to graduate with a 4.0, and that person was going around with all the other students having no idea what they were doing. Now, I'll let you decide how plausible that is, but it'd be a great TV show. And that's what House of Cards is. House of Cards is a great TV show. It doesn't very accurately reflect how the world works. The only modern political figure who came anywhere close to trying to be as aggressive and direct as Kevin Spacey is in that series was rapidly driven out of power. I mean, people in a free society, people don't put up with that stuff. And there are severe limits to how much pressure you can bring to bear. And so that doesn't mean there aren't a lot of other patterns that go on, but those aren't the ones that matter. Okay?
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. So my question is also about the shutdowns. And in the last shutdown, just this past fall, and as well as your shutdown, analysts estimate that billions upon billions of dollars were lost across all sectors in the economy. And my question is, do you believe that individuals and companies should have legal recourse in order to recover that revenue based upon an incompetent government?
No. And it doesn't strike me as plausible. I don't see how you'd ever quantify your particular hit, and I don't think how you'd have standing to sue for it. I think it would just be one more joyful opportunity for trial lawyers. It's part of the process of living in a free society, and I think there are costs. I think also, if they'd gotten to a really good deal, there would have been huge benefits. I mean, so could you then see, when we balanced the budget for 4 straight years, there were huge benefits. Nobody suggested we ought to go out and find some way to rip off the benefits that we had just created. We thought that's part of what you tried to do as a free society. So I don't think it's a practical solution. Yes, sir.
Hi. So in 1992, as Minority Whip, I think you supported the HART Act, which included an individual mandate for health insurance. And I'm curious why you supported that individual mandate and not President Obama's.
Yeah. A number of us, including the Heritage Foundation, looked at the idea of a mandate as a way of eliminating what was actually a real problem, which is people who deliberately avoid paying for insurance and then show up at the hospital and then don't pay their bills. Okay? Our conclusion was exactly what we're now finding, which is you couldn't make it functionally work without creating so many rules and so much centralized power that you really crippled the system. And that's why those of us who looked at it in the early 80s ultimately gave the idea up.
Hi. My question is, as somebody who was the Speaker of the House and a member of the House of Representatives for a long time, what is your opinion of gerrymandering?
I think gerrymandering is largely a mistake, and I think the system will eventually learn how to deal with it by running people in primaries, which is you're seeing start to happen. But I think in the long run, and of course it's a very old American tradition going back to the state of Massachusetts and Eldridge Gerry, which is where it came from, when he was trying desperately to keep the Federalist Party alive. So that's like 1811, 1812. But I think in the long run, it's much better for the country to have competitive parties. It's much better in terms of ideas to have competitive parties. When I see members who come from districts where they have no competition, don't have to go home and work hard, don't have any threat of losing their job, I see people who inevitably are not going to be very good congressmen over time.
Thank you. How can the U.S. realistically deal with a finite and currently dwindling supply of petroleum, given our transportation, economy, and agriculture all depend on them, and given our currently inadequate state of alternative energy resources?
Well, see, I'm confused by that question because the fact is, as I said a while ago, in one state, North Dakota, we went from 800 million barrels of reserve to 24 billion. The amount of natural gas that's probably available in the country is well over 200 years supply and may well be 500 or 600 years supply. You can make a policy argument, you don't like oil and you don't like gas and you don't like coal, but all the projections that were based on excuse me, on King Hubbard's idea of peak oil, they're all just baloney. They're not true. I was just at a coal plant in, or talking to people in Mississippi about a coal plant in Mississippi, which is actually going to capture, it's a brand new plant, a multi-billion-dollar investment. It captures all the carbon and it injects it into oil wells and it increases the amount of oil you can recover by 40%. So just that one device, that one technology leads to probably 10, 20 or 30 years more supply of oil. I think for all practical purposes, as we're discovering around the world, the development of the ability to look at natural gas in tight rocks, which is what we're talking about, probably means that there is, for all practical purposes, an almost infinite supply of natural gas on the planet. You're talking 300, 400, 500 years supply. It is likely that you have something on the order of a 200-year supply of oil as people discover all these new technologies and new methods of doing it. It's really a revolution. It's part of why I wrote Breakout, because the ideas that were predominant as late as 2006 in the energy field are just gone.
Mr. Speaker, one of the great privileges of being at Amherst is that we have a perennial football powerhouse, winning the NESCAC 2 of the last 3 years, and featuring one of the, it's a serious question, featuring one of the stiffest lines in the NESCAC. In light of the increasingly alarming injuries athletes are suffering in high school, collegiate, and professional football, as well as new discoveries of the long-term effects of severe brain trauma, do you think Congress needs to get involved to save the future of the sport, and what measures do you think need to be taken?
Well, I think it's a good argument for something I talk about in Breakout, and that is we need a very, very large, robust program of brain research, because the truth is the brain is the most complex single thing we look at. And whether you're talking about traumatic injuries, or you're talking about autism or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or mental health, there's no single area in health where we will have greater breakthroughs and a greater opportunity to both improve lives and save money than that area. And I suspect in a few years you'll have new designs of helmets and new designs of other things that will change all the equations. But I think it is a serious issue, and I do think we're learning that there's a lot more damage being done than we thought there was.
Good evening. The question I'd like to ask kind of stems from some of the things that you've talked about this evening. Based on the fact that we are trending toward energy independence in the United States, mostly in the aftermath of the shale gas revolution, will this have a large impact on our presence in the Middle East, specifically with the civil war in Syria right now? And there was a deal this week specifically between ExxonMobil and PetroChina, where they sold 25% of their interest in the Kurna 1 oil field in Iraq. Will we see more of this withdrawal from the Middle East and possibly ceding to the Asian nations with their energy deficit coming in next couple decades?
I think you will see an American national interest decline in the region as it becomes less relevant. And I think you will see us willing to say to a number of other countries, you have a lot bigger problem than we do. I actually think what's going to happen, and I want to draw a distinction between energy. I think energy will be a commercial issue. That is, countries need to sell the stuff in order to have money. It's part of what you're watching even with the Iranians. I mean, they need the money, and therefore they'll sell it. The Saudis need money to keep their society afloat. Otherwise, they have huge domestic problems. So that's a commercial argument. I think as a national security issue, to go back to what the other person asked about earlier, the biggest thing you got to confront is the Middle East is going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess for a long time. The number of people killed in Iraq every week right now is horrifying and not going down. The number of people killed in Pakistan. I mean, the number of people being killed in Syria, the number of people being killed in Libya, the amount of weapons being exported by Libya into Central Africa. I mean, this whole region has got to be rethought, and we have to have a really grim understanding that we're probably not going to fix it, and that we're probably faced with 30 or 40 years of coexisting with a mess. And I think that's a different issue. And the breakdown of the dictatorships, which may have seemed terrific in terms of the news media coverage, has actually meant a dramatic rise in violence and a dramatic rise in repression. And I think it's a very serious problem. And we'll take one or two more questions. Just
Thank you.
and let me say, by the way, any of you who do want, both Calista and I will have books in the room across the way right after this if you're interested. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there. My name is Adriana Perry. And so looking at the Affordable Care Act, a hefty piece of legislation that aims to provide access to nearly every individual residing in the U.S. to affordable health care, the Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to mandate states to expand their Medicaid programs, an expansion that would significantly improve the lives of traditionally underrepresented populations. For the states that have chosen not to expand, which is at least 20, what's your opinion on that?
The most recent studies indicate that Medicaid is such a broken system that you are as likely to have good care if you have no coverage as you are to have good care if you're in Medicaid, because so many doctors now refuse to take Medicaid. I think the whole system of government bureaucracy and government mandated things is going to collapse, and we're going to be in a huge fight between people who are going to argue that since government has failed, what we need is more government, and they'll want a national health system. And people are going to argue we need a totally new model of personalized health and personalized relationships. And I just think we have to rethink from the ground up, because you look at Medicaid in a lot of states, you can't get a doctor who will take the patient.
Right, but with the new program, the idea is to provide incentives for more doctors to accept Medicaid.
Yeah, except the problem is, if you'll notice in the articles as recently as today, the effect of the Affordable Care Act is you have affordable care as long as the doctor is available. You just had one of the designers of the Affordable Care Act say on television, I think it was last Sunday, that you can get any doctor you want as long as you pay more. Well, I don't think that was what the idea of affordable meant. You have Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson, all the best places in the country are increasingly being cut out. The number one cancer center in Florida is in Tampa. Moffitt Cancer Center has been cut out of Medicare Advantage by AARP and United Health on the grounds that the cuts to Medicare make it unsustainable. And this is, without any question, the best cancer treatment center in Florida. So I think what you're going to find is it's a semi-affordable, semi-care act, and that's not going to be an acceptable long-term solution.
Just a quick follow-up. What is your idea of the best healthcare system for America?
I actually wrote a book in 2002 called Saving Lives and Saving Money, to make the point that saving lives comes first. I think the best system is what you experience in most of your life. You should have control over your choices. You should know what the price and quality are, and you should have an ability. You know, for example, if you're very young, what you really need is a catastrophic health insurance. I mean, if you're very young, mathematically, young males don't go to the doctor, until they're like 35. So to design a one-size-fits-all model that basically says to the young, and this is what's going to kill for the Obamacare bill, to say to young people, in order to take care of your parents and grandparents, we're going to force you into a higher cost insurance than you need, but we're sure you're going to want to pay it because you're going to be so grateful for this opportunity to help your parents and grandparents. That ain't going to happen. I mean, you're going to see so many people who say, no, just let me pay the penalty, I'll pay the penalty and not worry about it. Because the penalty is going to be so much cheaper because they didn't have the guts politically to write in the size penalty you'd need. I mean, it would be so expensive to coerce people into this insurance plan. And I think Gallup just reported that 43% of the uninsured have said no, they're not going to buy it. I mean, so you have a program for the uninsured that the uninsured have said they're not going to buy, but so we have to now figure out a way to coerce them into buying it, because unless we can rip off the young to take care of their parents, we can't afford to keep the risk pool.
I'm sorry, you didn't answer my question about what your idea.
My model would be to have a highly personalized system, exactly like your smartphone and exactly like your ATM system, to allow you to have the right to buy the insurance you think you need, to allow you to have access to information on cost and quality. And I would require every hospital, every doctor, every medical technology to list price and quality. And then you get to be an informed consumer. For the very young, you ought to have a catastrophic plan at a very low price, because the odds are you're not going to be using it. As you get older, you're going to need more insurance because you're going to use it more. But you shouldn't require young people to buy a level of insurance that they don't need.
Thank you.
You're the last two. A sign of your persistence, eagerness, and I just can't turn you down.
Well, thank you so much for coming out to speak tonight. I'm just wondering if you think the decrease of teaching civics in American schools has overall led to a decrease in the sense of American exceptionalism among today's youth, and what the public school system should do to try to regenerate that.
It's a wonderful question. I'm wondering if my wife put you up to it. Because her 3 books are really designed to teach American civics to 4 to 8-year-olds. And the reason they matter is we have this extraordinary decline in the number of young Americans who know anything about America. She knows the numbers better than I do, but it's something like only 40% of 4th graders know why George Washington matters. And the numbers go down, not up, by the time they're seniors in high school. I mean, it is appalling how bad our teaching of American history is, and how many people manage to get out of school now with no knowledge of what it means to be an American or what it took for us to become a country. Okay?
You're the man. Just wanted to say that.
Yes. Did you set him up? Okay, yes, sir.
Hello.
You are the final penultimate question.
I'm Douglas Jameson. I just wanted to ask, or first state that the United States has the largest incarceration per capita in the world, meaning that we have the largest number of citizens,
Right.
largest percentage of citizens in jail and in prison. And a great number of these citizens are in jail for some would consider victimless crimes, drug usage, and they're in jail for 10 to who knows how long, many years. How do you think we should address this issue? Oh, I forgot to state that many of the people within prison that are in jail for drug issues, a disproportionate percentage of them are from lower socioeconomic areas, despite the fact that the amount of drug users are evenly dispersed throughout all socioeconomic levels. What do you think? How would you like to address this issue, and what do you think the United States can do better?
Well, I think you put your finger on an extraordinarily important issue, and one where, a little bit to our surprise, Van Jones, who does Crossfire with me, and I are both working on some ideas jointly that we're going to produce. We think that we should fundamentally revisit the whole question of prison. We think that we should, again, using distance learning, make sure that we're designing institutions where people learn if they have to be in them. I would draw a very sharp distinction between violent prisoners who are being kept there in order to protect the rest of us and nonviolent prisoners. And in the case of nonviolent prisoners, our goal should be one time, get well enough educated that you get out and you get a job and you never come back. And in the case of some victimless crimes, I really think we are much better off to deal with them as matters of mental health or matters of social behavior. I mean, one of the dirty secrets of American government in the last 30 years is that as we closed the state mental hospitals, we increased the number of people who are mentally ill who are in prison. Now, that's just wrong. And I think we all have to understand this is one of the unintended consequences of what was seen as good government in the 70s. And it has had a terrible effect. And I think that we need to recognize how much that needs to be changed. So I'm delighted you raised that question. It's central. When people talk about inequality, it is central to understanding the crisis we have with many, many people who are in neighborhoods where there are no fathers. There are neighborhoods where people are learning no skills, where you go into prison nonviolent and you come out as a trained criminal. These are, American prisons are among the things that we can be least proud of, I think, in our entire society, because we have really not paid attention in a serious way to doing it right. So anyway, I am thrilled to be here. I want to say once again, happy birthday. And we look forward to seeing some of you next door to sign some books.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.